The envelope arrived at the wrong table, and nobody noticed except the child. It was a Thursday evening in early November, and the dining room of the Hargrove estate on the edge of Oakville had been transformed into something that looked borrowed from a magazine. White linen draped every surface. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead and scattered it in small, quiet explosions across the ceiling. 63 guests had come to celebrate the retirement of Douglas Hargrove, 60 years old. Senior partner at Callaway and Hargrove, a man who had spent 37 years turning other people's worst days into workable outcomes. The firm had grown under his name into one of the most respected legal practices in the Greater Toronto area, and tonight was meant to be the exhale after a very long hold. Douglas stood near the fireplace at the far end of the room, holding a glass of scotch he hadn't touched yet. He was tall, still broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples, and the kind of calm in his face that came not from ease but from discipline. He had spent decades learning to show nothing in a courtroom. That habit did not leave him at parties. His daughter Vivienne stood beside him for a moment, then moved away to speak with someone near the bar. His wife, Eleanor, was somewhere near the entrance, greeting the last of the arrivals with the practiced warmth she'd always had more naturally than he did. The room hummed. Someone laughed too loudly near the windows. The catering staff moved between guests with quiet efficiency, and the long table at the center of the room held gifts stacked at one end. Wrapped boxes, envelopes tucked between them, a few items that had arrived earlier in the day by courier. Douglas noticed none of it specifically. He was being spoken to by a former colleague from the Crown's office, a man named Bertrand, who was telling a story Douglas had already heard twice. He smiled anyway. He did not see the child watching the gift table. Her name was Isla. She was 8 years old, the daughter of one of Douglas's junior associates, a woman named Teresa Okafor, who had been with the firm for 4 years, and had been invited tonight, partly as a professional courtesy, and partly because Douglas had quietly noticed she was the hardest-working person in the office. Teresa was across the room now, speaking carefully with one of the senior partners. She had left Isla at the small side table with a plate of food and a quiet instruction to stay there and not touch anything. Isla had eaten half the food and had been watching the gift table for 11 minutes. She was not a fidgety child. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady, the way some children do when they are taking something seriously that the adults around them have already dismissed as background. She had noticed something when one of the catering staff set down a long, flat box near the back of the gift arrangement, something about the way the man had done it. Not placed it, set it, deliberately, close to the edge with the card facing down instead of up. She had watched him do it. He had not looked at any of the other gifts. He had not looked around the room the way the other staff did, checking whether they were in someone's way. He had set the box down and walked back toward the kitchen hallway without pausing. Isla had looked at the box. Then she had looked at the man's back as he disappeared through the swinging door. Then she had looked at the box again. She got up from her chair. The box was wrapped in dark green paper with a silver ribbon. It was not the most elaborate thing on the table, but it was the longest, and the card was tucked beneath it in a way that would make it difficult to read without lifting the box. Isla did not touch it. She leaned forward and tilted her head and read the card from the side. For Douglas. With gratitude. V. She stood very still. Then she went to find her mother. Teresa Okafor was mid-sentence when Isla appeared at her elbow. Teresa looked down with the expression mothers develop, the one that says this had better be important without saying it out loud. Isla tugged her sleeve once, which was their signal. Teresa excused herself with an apology and stepped aside. "What is it, sweetheart?" "There's a box on the table," Isla said. "A man put it there." He put the card face down. Teresa looked toward the gift table. "Okay." He didn't look around like the other ones do. He just put it and left. Isla. "The card says it's from someone named V, but I don't think it came with the other presents. The other ones all have proper bows. This one has a ribbon tied like you'd tie a shoelace." Teresa looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she looked at the table again. She could see the box from where she stood. Long, dark green, silver ribbon. It looked like any other gift. "I'm sure it's fine," she said gently. "Why don't you go back to your seat, Mama?" The man put the card face down. Teresa hesitated. She was in the middle of a conversation that mattered to her career. The room was full of people she needed to impress. Isla was 8 years old and had a tendency to notice things that turned out to mean nothing. "I'll have a look in a few minutes," she said. "Go back to your seat." Isla went back to her seat. She sat down. She looked at the box. She looked at her mother, who had already turned back to her conversation. She looked at the kitchen door, which had not opened again. After 4 minutes, she got up and walked across the room to Douglas Hargrove. He was alone for the first time all evening, standing near the fireplace with his untouched scotch. She stopped about 2 feet from him and looked up at him with the directness that children have before they learn to soften it. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Mr. Hargrove?" Douglas looked down. He had not registered that there was a child at this party. He took her in, the neat braids, the careful posture, the expression that was neither nervous nor casual. "I am," he said. "I think there's something wrong with one of your presents." He studied her face. There was no drama in it, which was what kept him from smiling the way adults smile at children who say unexpected things. She looked like someone delivering information. "Which one?" he said. "The long green one with the silver ribbon, near the back." He looked toward the table. He could see it from where he stood. It did look like a gift. It looked like any gift. "What makes you think something's wrong?" he asked. "A man from the catering staff put it there." But he put the card face down and he didn't look around and he went straight back to the kitchen. "The other staff don't do that." Douglas set his glass down on the mantel. He looked at the child again. "What's your name?" "Isla. My mum works for you. Teresa Okafor." Ah, he knew Teresa. Knew her work, rather, her filings, her research memos, the quiet consistency of her. He looked at Isla with slightly different attention. "And you told your mother?" "She said she'd look in a few minutes. She was talking to someone. There was no accusation in how she said it. She was simply reporting." Douglas found this more convincing than if she had been upset about it. He crossed the room. Isla followed 2 steps behind, which he noticed and did not object to. At the table he stood and looked at the box, without touching it. She was right about the ribbon. It was tied with a simple double knot, not a bow. The card was face down. He reached for the edge of it. "Mr. Hargrove." He turned. The voice came from his left, and it belonged to a woman named Veronica Ashfield. 55, sharp-faced, impeccably dressed, who had been a close friend of his for nearly 2 decades. They had gone through articling together at the same firm, survived the same difficult partners, built careers along parallel lines. She had helped plan this evening. She was one of the people he trusted most in the world. She was looking at the gift table with an expression he could not immediately read. "Ronnie," he said. "Don't open that yet," she said. Her voice was even. "There's an order I had in mind for the gifts. I was going to bring them over one at a time." Douglas held the edge of the card but didn't turn it over. He watched her face. "Which one's yours?" A pause. "A small one. The blue box. The square one near the front." He looked at the card under his fingers, for Douglas, with gratitude. "V.V. Veronica." He set the card down, still face down. "All right," he said. "We'll do it your way." She smiled, warm, familiar, and said she'd get Eleanor to come over in a few minutes when everyone had gathered. Then she moved away, unhurried, in the direction of the bar. Douglas stood at the table for a moment. Isla was beside him, still watching. "She said not to open it," Isla said quietly. "I heard. She didn't ask which one you were looking at." He turned to look at the child. She held his gaze steadily. He thought about Veronica Ashfield. 37 years. The articling lunches, the difficult cases, the late nights, the partnership negotiations. She had been at his wedding. She had called him when Eleanor had been in the hospital 3 years ago, and she had sat in that waiting room for 4 hours without being. He thought about the way she had said, "Don't, which one is that?" Not, "Oh, that's mine." Not, "I can explain the card." Just, "Don't open that yet." He picked up the box. Isla took a step back. Not from fear, but from the instinct of someone who has said what they needed to say and is now waiting. Douglas turned the box over in his hands. It was light. He pressed gently on one side of the wrapping and felt something shift inside. Small, loose, rolling slightly. Not the weight of something solid, the weight of something carefully arranged. He set it back down. He turned to find his wife. Eleanor was near the entrance, and when he approached her, she must have read something in his face, because she stepped away from the woman she'd been speaking with immediately. He leaned in and said 3 words quietly. She looked at the table, then at him, and nodded once. Eleanor found the house manager, a young man named Clifford, and spoke to him in the kitchen hallway. Clifford made a call. Douglas returned to the gift table and stood beside it, and when Bertrand came over to resume the story Douglas had already heard twice, Douglas smiled and said he needed just a moment. 2 of the guests were off-duty RCMP officers. That was a coincidence that turned out not to be a coincidence. Douglas had quietly ensured, when the guest list was being finalized, that 2 people at this party would know what to do if something went wrong. He had worked in criminal law for long enough to know that a man in his position should always have 2 people at any large gathering who know what to do if something goes wrong. Both of them were beside him within 4 minutes. They did not open the box. In the room. Clifford moved it to a small anteroom off the main hallway, and the officers followed, and Douglas followed the officers. Isla stayed in the doorway. They opened it there. Inside, under the silver ribbon and the dark green paper, nested in a lining of white foam shaped carefully to fit, were items. The first was a vial. glass, sealed, about the length of a finger, containing a clear liquid. The second was a small handwritten note folded twice, which said only, "You always did talk too much in the end, Douglas." The room was very quiet. One of the officers, a man named Price, looked at the vial without touching it. "We need to call this in," he said. Douglas was looking at the note. The handwriting was familiar to him. He had seen it on birthday cards, on post-it notes stuck to his office door, on a sympathy card that had arrived the week Eleanor's mother died. He folded the note back the way it had been. "Yes," he said, "we do." The party continued in the other room, or something like it. The music was still playing, the glasses were still clinking, and Eleanor moved through the room with the composure of someone who had been married to a criminal lawyer for 31 years and understood that sometimes you simply hold the room together while the men in the anteroom do what needs to be done. She said Douglas would be with them shortly. She refilled a few glasses. She laughed at someone's joke. Veronica Ashfield was at the bar when the officers came out of the hallway. She saw Price's face first, and whatever she read there made her set down her glass very carefully. The way people do when their hands have started to shake and they're trying not to show it. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to speak to a lawyer." Price told her that was her right. She looked across the room, once, toward the gift table, as though the box might still be there. It wasn't. Then she looked at Douglas, who was standing in the hallway entrance, and the expression on her face was something that defied the vocabulary of 37 years of friendship. It was not guilt, exactly. It was the face of someone who had made a calculation a long time ago and had believed until this moment that the calculations was sound. Douglas held her gaze. He didn't say anything. There was nothing he needed to say. He had been in rooms with people who had done terrible things, and he had learned that the silence after the fact speaks better than any words either party could manage. She was walked out through the side entrance. 3 guests saw it happen, but Eleanor had already asked the string quartet to play something, and the music covered most of it. The party wound down over the following hour. People said their goodbyes without knowing quite why the energy had shifted. Douglas shook hands and accepted hugs and said it had been a wonderful evening, and he meant parts of that, which was enough. When the last guest had left, he sat down in the empty dining room. Eleanor brought him the scotch he'd never touched. She sat beside him. Outside, Clifford and 2 staff members were moving quietly between tables, gathering things. Teresa Okafor found him before she left. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Isla tried to tell me. I should have listened sooner." Douglas looked at Teresa, and then passed her to where Isla was standing near the doorway in her coat, still with that stesh expression, watching him the way she had watched the gift table. "No harm came of it," he said, and then to Isla directly. "You were very observant tonight." Isla looked at him. "The card was face down," she said, as though this explained everything, because to her it did. He nodded. "It was." She seemed satisfied with that. She took her mother's hand and they left, and Douglas watched them go through the tall front windows. The small figure in the coat, the mother beside her, the 2 of them moving under the portico lights toward the parking area. Eleanor put her hand on his arm. "How long?" she asked. She meant with Veronica. She meant how long had something been wrong, or off, or quietly building toward this room. He thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said. "Long enough for her to decide. Not long enough for me to see it." Eleanor was quiet. "There's going to be a long process," he said. "The vial will have to be analyzed. There'll be charges, presumably. The firm will need to respond." He said it in the measured way of someone who has been through long processes before, who knows the shape of them even when the details aren't yet clear. "Tonight," Eleanor said. "Don't think about the process." He looked at her. She had always been the one who could draw that line for him, the one between the work and the rest of it. He had relied on that line more than he'd ever told her. "All right," he said. In the weeks that followed, the analysis confirmed what Price had suspected in the anteroom. The charges came as Douglas had expected. The firm issued a statement, careful and precise, and then the process continued in the way of these things, through hearings and documentation and the long institutional work of the law moving at its own pace. Douglas returned to the office on the Monday after the party and found a small card on his desk. It was from Teresa, handwritten, and it thanked him for the invitation and apologized again for not acting sooner. He wrote her a note in return, brief and honest, which said that she had raised a child who paid attention, and that, in his experience, paying attention was the rarest skill in any room. 3 months later, he offered Teresa Okafor a senior associate position at the firm. She accepted. He also sent a small package to Isla, a book on Canadian law written for young readers, and a note that said only, "Thank you for looking at what the adults missed. Keep doing that. It matters more than you know." He had thought out about what to write for a long time, and in the end, those were the truest words he had.